In full disclosure, these are companies I consult to. These companies make drugs that are being used by kids in this field. I'm not going to go into the differential diagnosis. I can tell by the discussion here I don't need to do that, so I'm just going to skip over that. Let me just say a word about the prevalence. Permit me a brief digression. The Autism and Developmental Disorders Monitoring Network from the CDC came out about a year ago with a estimate of 67 per 10,000 for the full spectrum. That's roughly 7 per 1,000. That's the 1 in 150 you've heard so much on the late night TV. That's for the whole so-called spectrum. Even though they'll say autism, they're talking about autism, Asperger's, and PDD. So here's the digression. First of all, the big problem in all of the past studies up until about 1994 is they relied on already diagnosed cases. And we know in every single disorder in pediatrics, if you only rely on the identified cases, you will miss some because there are people who haven't made their way to clinic. So there was a severe undercount before 1994. Something else happened in 1994. DSM-4 broadened the criteria, especially for PDD and OS, but also for autism. The other thing that happened is there started to be actual community studies, people going out into the community and finding cases that were not previously identified. Incidentally, in the CDC study, they started with identified cases, but looked at the records of all of the kids in the participating schools that were in special education and identified almost half again more cases of PDD. So if they had only relied on the identified cases, that prevalence figure would have been much lower. And here is a slide from the state of California, and it shows the rise in the identified cases. So this is not a good prevalence study, but it's a very clear study about trend. It shows in the kids born in 1987 compared to the kids born in 1994. So they're entering school 5 years later. And what you see here is a steady increase in identified cases of autism. And again, this is full spectrum, and they're identified in the school. So this is a statewide Department of Education data. The top shows the decline in children during that same period who are classified as mentally retarded. So there's a whole lot of substitution going on here. And here is, in response to, if I had been on Larry King Live last night, this is what I would have said. Bernadine Healy, the former Director of Health and Human Services, said that this study has not been done. There have been 2 studies showing this. The study shows in nearly 28,000 children ages 5 to 17 in Quebec, they found 180 cases of autism spectrum again. And there's the breakdown. Very interesting look. Asperger's is the least common, which has been shown in other studies as well. The highest group was among kindergartners. Those children were born after they stopped using thimerosal in vaccines in Canada. That's the cohort that is the highest prevalence, and they were not exposed to thimerosal. And so this is the gory detail. They just were able to track exposure to thimerosal and showed that the kids that had no exposure at all had the highest prevalence. Why? Because they're getting identified better. In the study in Canada, 180 cases in Quebec, 155 of them had already been identified. So they're doing a better job. The gap between identified and real cases out there is much smaller than it is here in the United States. Okay, so that's the end of my digression. There's very little evidence that a specific exposure like thimerosal, and you can run the same story for the MMR. It's just not quite as clean because of that natural experiment in Canada. So how do we come at the medication story? It's actually quite similar to the way we approach the world in Tourette. target symptoms. Where is the biggest problem? And they could be in the core features of autism: the social interaction, repetitive behavior, impaired communication. Unfortunately, we don't have great candidates for those core symptoms. I'll show you in a bit some data on repetitive behavior, and it's not very encouraging, the results so far. So specific behavior problems that are not part of the diagnosis, but often the reason that the parents are looking for help. And that's hyperactivity and a new triad for you: tantrums, aggression, and self-injury. So these are data from 2 surveys done by my friend Mike Amon, and there's only 1 or 2 points to be made from this somewhat complicated slide, and it's in the white. You see that they did a survey of parents in 1993 and then came back in 2001 and did a survey. Notice the increase in the sample size just incidentally. Now, North Carolina, you may know, is where TEACH is, Project TEACH, which has been a very effective network for children and families with autism going back 30 years. But even there, where they had a pretty good network, there was an increase in people self-declaring that their child has autism and willing to participate in a survey. And in both cases, the response rate is about 50%. What's causing that rise? It's in those 3 white areas: antipsychotics, antidepressants, and stimulants. If you look at the first line, antipsychotics, you say, it's only up from 12% to 16%. But it's a complete turnover from the older antipsychotics to the newer ones. So it really is a big story. Antidepressants, mostly the SSRIs. This is a decade of Prozac, right? 6% to 21%. A survey in California, 30% of children with PDD are prescribed the SSRIs. Stimulants goes up 2-fold. Quiz question number 1: which medication is the best studied in the world of PDD? Secretin. Secretin. 13 placebo-controlled studies and some very well done single subject design studies. About over 600 children studied. Nothing even comes close. But it doesn't work. Hyperactivity in children with PDD. Again, this is something that you all know, but just to mention as a on the side, DSM-4 says if a kid has PDD, they shouldn't be given a diagnosis of ADHD. And what they're saying is that the PDD trumps ADHD. The trouble is that a lot of times these kids are hyper. They are impulsive. They are distractible. And that is what the parents will be asking for help. So just for fun, what would you take as a study that's just large enough? Now I'm looking for the minimum number. What's the minimum number that a study should be? That it should turn around and have an impact on practice. 10 per group or 20 total? 20 per group, 40 total? Good enough? If we say 40, just to be, I don't know, liberal, lenient, permissive, if we look at the treatment of hyperactivity, there's only 1 study greater than 40 in the PDD literature. And that's the study that we did with methylphenidate. So I won't go into the crazy detail of the design, but we designed the study to learn as much as possible about safety and efficacy. So we had 66 children that entered into a crossover design, 3 different dose levels of methylphenidate and placebo, random assignment for the order. And when I say 3 levels, I mean low, low, medium, medium, and medium. But we call it low, medium, and high. But if you look closely at the dosing, and it is one of the slides if it's readable, we knew that we weren't going to go in with the same kind of dosing as in typically developing children with ADHD. IQ range is fairly wide, and most of the kids were about 7.5 years old. Most of them had autistic disorder. So sort of jumping right to the bottom line, what I've put here